Wonderful presentation. Now we're going to go on to a presentation by the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. All right, Neil, are you on the line?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Neil Ayers. I work for Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve, which is just south of the preserve you were just watching. It's in Lee County. And with your permission, I'm going to turn off my video because I'm not sure how good my bandwidth is here at my wireless network at home. So I'm going to turn it off. There we go. Okay, thanks to Mary, we've already described what colonial birds are, and there's nesting activity, and the nesting activity is measured. Mary was kind enough to explain for me what critical wildlife areas were, which is helpful for me. The top line there is not familiar to many of you. It's called multidimensional scaling, or MDS ordination. Ordination is a statistical technique used to attempt to visually interpret similarities between a lot of different variables. Typically, you'd have a lot of different species. When I say a lot, you could have 5, 10, 50, 100, and different sites. You might have 100 sites as well. So, and as we get into this, that will become a little clearer, I hope. Next slide, please. This is the abstract from the original poster that I was asked to submit. It's fairly brief. However, it's a little too long for this presentation. I noticed that it's in the proceedings, so if anybody has any further interest, this could be a way for you to pick up a few more points that I tried to make. Next question, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Mary pointed out, that for some time now, Estero Bay has been doing something very similar to the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Reserves, which is we go out and we count nesting activity of the colonial birds. And we do so for about 35 islands, 3 of which are CWA mangrove islands. Next slide, please. Okay, the study group, study area rather, is Estero Bay. You'll notice that up to the north, there is Matanzas Pass, which is also, I believe, a spoil island. Big Carlos Pass in the middle, and down to the south is Coconut Point East. These are our 3 islands of concern. And I just would like to emphasize that we did not select these islands. The birds selected these islands. Next slide, please. Okay, the second method is that on the boat, the observers, when they spot a nest, they tell somebody named the recorder. The recorder is a person on the boat who fills out these field sheets. When we get back to the office at some point, we transcribe the field sheet data onto a master Excel spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is fairly big, cumbersome. Typically, if we want to make any analysis from it, we make either line charts or bar graphs, similar to the ones you've already seen. But for this presentation, we thought we'd try something a little different, which is the ordination. So next slide, please. All right, so for the ordination, what we're going to do is we're going to select some data. In this case, we're going to pick a year. We picked 2016. We're going to pick those months which have the most nesting activity for each island. So you'll notice that in Big Carlos Island, that month was June. At Coconut Point, that month was May. And in Matanzas Pass, that month was June. And if you look in the lower right, you'll see those totals, 74, 85, and 111 respectively. Okay, next slide, please. From that data that you just saw, we're going to go into a software package called R, and we are going to take that data and we're going to do some stuff with it. The actual program that we run is a package called Vagin, and we're going to use a function called meta MDS, which is essentially a batch file that runs, in this case, a break Curtis dissimilarity. It does a bunch of other things as well, which I would just as soon not get into myself. So let's see what the results are by looking at the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is a graph of what the ordination, the non-metric multidimensional spacing ordination runs. Again, so we see this is for the year 2016, and I have run these, by the way, for other years as well. And everything you see here is based upon proximity or nearness or closeness or farness. You know, and it's helpful to keep in mind that when you're doing an ordination, the X and Y axes, unlike most other graphs, don't really represent anything, which is sort of odd, but that's just the way these things are. So don't try to interpret any of this as independent or dependent variables. So we see that, for example, over at Coconut Point East on our right, the double-crested cormorant seems to be very close to it, as well as the brown pelican and the great blue heron. If we look down to the lower part of the slide, we'll see that the reddish egret and the snowy egrets are associated primarily with Big Carlos Island. Also in the middle, between Matanzas and Big Carlos, there's the tricolor. So let's, can I have the next slide, please? See something, I can show you something. Yes, okay, so the tricolor, why is the tricolor heron halfway between Matanzas Pass and Big Carlos Pass? So let's look at let's go back to our data, which is what we often have to do when we're dealing with an ordination. We look at Big Carlos Pass, it had 11 nests, Matanzas Pass had 20 nests, but Coconut Point that year had 0 nests. It was not always the case, but that was that year. So when we look back at our ordination, we see that the tricolor heron is spatially much sort of halfway, not quite between Matanzas and San Carlos, but is actually some distance from Coconut Point, which is to say that the ordination is trying to tell us something about the data. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the year 2012. And one thing we can notice is that the islands are actually a little closer together than they were in the previous year that we looked at, 2016, which the graph is telling us that, or the ordination is telling us that the nesting activity was a little more similar between the islands than it was in the previous year. We also we'll see that the snowy egret is associated with Matanzas Pass. So if we were to go back, we would probably see that most of the nesting activity, or perhaps all of it, was in Matanzas Pass. We can see that the reddish egret is closely associated or very close to Big Carlos Pass. So if we went back to the data, we would expect to see that the reddish egret's nesting activity was most prominent on Big Carlos Pass. One thing you'll notice about the labels, that they do sort of step on each other, which is not a great situation, and one which I have not been able to rectify yet, although I think it can be done. Next slide, please. Finally, I would just like to point out there's let's say 3 bullet points, 3 discussions, 3 conclusions would be that these results can be cryptic if you're not used to them, but they tend to, but they conform to the first law of geography, which is everything is related, but near things are more related than distant things. And you can use that law to help decode ordination graphs. Also keep in mind, as I said earlier, that in DMS and other ordination axes mean very little. And finally, let's say that I'd just like to mention that although R is a powerful software, there are other proprietary software choices that can perform the same function, same analyses. The one I'm noticed or familiar with is one called Primer, which was used regionally and locally by the FGCU team, specifically Tully et al. In 2006 on their oyster studies. And could I have the next slide, please? Okay, that's my thank you slide. Thank you for listening to me for 10 minutes. And could I have the next slide, please? Okay, that's my credit slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. We are now going to go to our question and answer, the last one of this session. I would remind those of you online that we need you to stay on to the concluding comments in order to send a chat during that period for your C continuing education credits in order to be eligible and record that for AWRA. With that, Neil, feel free to answer as many as you have time for.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start left to right. Nice intro to MDS from someone named Wynn. Next one is, what does similar nesting activity across islands tell us? That's an excellent question. We would have to go out and find out. One of the things interesting about Ordination is it tells you where to look or what questions you should be asking, but it doesn't really answer very many of them. So we would maybe conclude that the way the fish are distributed might be a more similar, or might be more evenly distributed that year. We might find that predators are not present on those islands. Sometimes they get there. So it's really not going to tell us very much unless we go out and ask more questions, I guess, to answer that quickly. Okay, do we see correlations among bird species when looking at selected sites? I guess the fact when the bird groups when the title of the bird in the graph is close to another bird, we would have to say that we would suspect that there is a correlation between the abundance of nesting of those two species, which would give us an opportunity to go back and look at our data to see if that is in fact the case. Okay, overall takeaways, let me skip that one for a second. Have you tried Primer? I have never run Primer. Primer costs money, and I'm not enrolled at FGCU, so I can't use their copy. Have any of these survey efforts been used for invasive reptiles on rookeries? That's a good question, which would, I sort of alluded to that. It might give us a hint if we find that one species disappears over the years in our Ordination. There may be a problem with reptiles. Okay, oh, good question. Since different species have different peak nesting times, does a selected month with a peak total count result in bias? I haven't really looked closely enough, and for this particular study, we decided, the decision was made just to pick that month with the greatest nesting activity. They tend to be very closely packed. It tends to be May, June, and July. However, you could do many more analyses and find out if in fact the month does make a difference. Okay, and finally, how does this method of, I missed one, overall takeaway. I want to get back to that. How does this method of analysis inform management decisions? I don't know. That's too hard to answer right just at the spur of the moment. An overall takeaway on nesting activities improving or declining. Everything, even with all of our studying, I'm inclined to think that a lot of it's anecdotal, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. So I'm going to stop right now. Okay, and how does it? Okay, so
that's a great conclusion, and unfortunately we are out of time, but for further questions. But again, everyone, feel free to reach out to Neil directly. His contact information is in the proceedings. And we just have a few closing remarks here, so I ask everyone to hang on just a couple more minutes. But I do want to first really thank